Thanks, Mac. Are there any Greeks here? The Greeks are to blame for lots of things. Not least of these is the somewhat preposterous idea of Asia. For thousands of years, after strategists in Greece came up with this Eurocentric idea, the many non-European peoples who inhabited the Eurasian landmass were blissfully unaware that they were supposed to share an identity as Asians. After all, except for the brief period of near unification under the Mongols, they had little to do with each other. Arabs and Chinese, like Indians, Japanese, Malays, Persians, Russians, Turks, and others, had different histories, cultures, languages, religious traditions, and political traditions. Their economies were only tenuously connected by the gossamer strands of the Silk Road and its maritime counterpart. But all this is now changing. Asia is leaving the realm of Greek myth and becoming a reality. Asians are drawing together as they rise in wealth and power. Their economies, their companies, and their influence now extend beyond their own continent, as well as throughout it. In the 20th century, the world had to adapt to American domination of its global political economy. Americans must now adapt to a political economy increasingly centered on Asia. In much of Asia, as late as the last decades of the last century, post-colonial hangover, deranged politics with love-hate relationships that distorted attitudes toward the West. This is easy to understand. After all, Western colonialism had humbled armies, crushed the self-esteem, and suppressed the values and political traditions of societies from Turkey to China. In West Asia, Turks, Arabs, and Persians, bit by bit, yielded their autonomy, their territory, and their national dignity to predatory Europeans. In India, the British overthrew Muslim rule, imposed a single sovereignty, and embroiled the once isolated subcontinent in the quarrels of Europe. States in South Asia that had for long contributed 1/5 of the global economy were subordinated to British mercantilism and subjected to British rule. The East Indies and Indochina also fell to European imperialism. In East Asia, only Thailand and Japan embraced key elements of Westernization with sufficient alacrity to keep the West more or less at bay. Japan did this with such drive and discipline that it soon imposed its own colonial rule in Korea and parts of China. In the Russo-Japanese War and World War II, Japan went on to demonstrate that when allied to modern technology, its martial traditions would let it punch far above its nominal military and economic weight. Russia gobbled up Central Asia. It gnawed away at China from the north as Western powers nibbled at it from the south and east. Foreigners carved China into spheres of influence, annexed parts of its territory, and placed bits and pieces of it under extraterritorial rule. Europeans and Americans had to do this, we said, to be able to exercise our right to peddle narcotics and proselytize an alien religious ideology to the Chinese people over the entirely inexplicable objections of their government. The colonial order in Asia collapsed in the wake of World War II, as the rest of Asia rejected the reassertion of foreign control. America occupied Japan and placed it under our tutelage and protection. China defiantly stood up, expelling foreigners and their influence from its soil. Southeast Asia revolted against its various colonial masters and their American allies. India hived off Pakistan as both took their freedom from the British. Iran reemerged as an aspirant to regional power. Turkey took its place as the stalwart eastern bulwark of Europe's defenses against an expanded Soviet empire. A new era began. Only in West Asia, where Africa, Asia, and Europe intersect, where Judaism and Christianity began, where Islam is centered, and where the world's energy resources are concentrated, did major elements of the World War II order persist. In the last days of colonialism, European Jews conquered and colonized 4/5 of the Holy Land, displacing many of its inhabitants. Both Palestinian Arabs and others in the region reacted with shock and horror at this unexpected culmination of both European anti-Semitism and the age of imperialism. Neither the shock nor the awe have yet been cured by Israeli or Western diplomacy. During the Cold War, the states of the Middle East sank into uneasy dependence on the contending superpowers, which handled conflicts among them as proxy wars. Israel aside, leaders in the region became noted for their fatalistic deference to powerful foreign patrons and their feckless accommodation of European, Soviet, and American insults to the sovereignty, independence, and cultural identities of the peoples over whom they ruled. The first rip in the fabric of this neo-colonial order came in the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. That ended Iran's role as America's gendarme in the Middle East and forced the United States to switch to military reliance on Saudi Arabia and Egypt. Nearly simultaneously, Egypt's American-brokered peace with Israel made the preservation of the autocratic status quo in the region an overriding priority of U.S. policy. Even a cursory reading of the Camp David Accords is a poignant reminder that they were explicitly premised on Israel's undertaking to end its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and to facilitate self-determination for the Palestinians. There's actually quite an elaborate set of procedures to accomplish the latter in those agreements. Failure to do either of these things ensured that the peace between Israel and Egypt was a cold one that could not warm. The Palestinians gained no relief from humiliation and injustice. Instead, they saw both intensify. Peace with Israel lost any chance of gaining legitimacy in Egypt or elsewhere in the region. In large measure due to this, Israel and the United States have become thoroughly detested by Egyptians, other Arabs, and in the Islamic world as a whole. America's willingness to underwrite the Mubarak dictatorship and the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan with cash, weapons, and moral support bought the Camp David framework at least the appearance of durability. But the ability of the United States to substitute conflict avoidance for a real effort to make peace has probably expired, along with the Mubarak regime. Since Israel continues adamantly to prefer the expansion of its borders to peace with the Palestinians or its neighbors, and since there hasn't been a serious peace process for more than a decade, it's in fact unclear how America will continue to stabilize and contain the Israel-Palestine conflict in the days to come. It's unclear how much influence, if any, we Americans will now exercise in the region as a whole. The recent uprisings of Arab citizens against their rulers have cast aside the fatalistic sense of impotence and obsequious deference to foreign power, with which Arabs long hobbled themselves. They see the United States as having cynically supported despotism over democracy to keep Israel safe from Arab reactions to its behavior. Neither Israeli nor American interests have been the immediate target of the revolutions that we see in progress. But the decisions of Egyptians and other Arabs to seize control of their own future will affect both Israelis and Americans. 30 years after the Iranian upheaval, the post-colonial order in the Middle East is at last collapsing. The spreading disorder in West Asia comes after American policies in the opening decade of this century thoroughly discredited the United States, devalued its military power, and cemented Iran's influence in Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria. Region-wide political change is occurring as America withdraws from Iraq, leaving behind a ruined country riven by secular passions and with no sure strategic orientation. Meanwhile, the United States Armed Forces are generating more terrorists than they are killing in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is the context in which Western Asia's ties to other parts of the continent are thickening. Some might consider it ominous. The Arabs, Turks, and others in West Asia were trying to reduce their dependence on the United States even before current events illustrated how much contempt they feel for our perceived hypocrisy and how little weight the American word now has among them. They are, of course, well aware that they cannot avoid a measure of reliance on America. The United States is still the only military world power. It is able to invade, if not impose its will on, every corner of the globe. Americans count for over 1/5 of global consumption and are the world's greatest debtors. The United States may no longer be the global source of new ideas for managing world and regional affairs. It once was, but it has the ability to block reform initiatives from others. So like other Asians, Middle Easterners are locked in a Catholic marriage with America. Much as some of them, the Iranians, for example, might wish to send the United States packing, no divorce is possible. But, of course, they are Muslims and untroubled by polygamy. So they are busily contracting new relationships to offset their still substantial ties to America. China and India, in particular, are happy to oblige. They're not only the fastest growing large economies in the world, but the fastest growing markets for Persian Gulf oil and gas. Over the decade to come, China and India are expected to account for over half the growth in global energy demand. A spectacular rise of Asia's industrious East and South has fueled a boom in its energy-rich West. Chinese construction companies, having proven their capabilities in vast infrastructure projects at home, are building big things from Mecca to Tehran. If the current emblems of the United States in the region are bombers, boots on the ground, and lethally armed drones, China increasingly evokes images of tower and gantry cranes, engineers, and containers of consumer goods. The Chinese are succeeding in establishing an influential presence in the region for the same reasons Americans once did. They pay cash, deliver value for money, and make no demands on business partners or hosts to conform to their values, endorse their political preferences, or help them advance an imperial agenda. In these respects, America has met a rival, and it is us as we used to be. But if China is admired for its apparent modesty and competence, no one in the region, still less elsewhere in Asia, sees it as an exemplar of relevant political ideals, as many, if not all, once saw America. This underscores a key feature of Asia's integration. It is driven by economic and financial factors, not politics or ideology. Trade between the Persian Gulf region, China, and India has been growing at 30 to 40% over the past decade each year. By 2050, over that same period, China grew from 10% of the size of the US economy to 40%. By 2050, only 40 years from now, China's economy may well be twice as large as the United States. And India's economy will match our own in size, they say. We're talking serious economic growth in Asia with serious geostrategic consequences. Oil, engineers, and consumer goods are not the only factors drawing West Asia toward the east. Arab investors are flush with cash. They once had a very strong preference for putting their money to work in the United States. American Islamophobia and the reawakening of ancient Islamic ties to China, as well as Central and Southeast Asia, are well along in curing them of this preference. Meanwhile, both public and private Arab investment in China's petrochemical industries, services, banks, telecommunications, and real estate has surged. The same trend is setting in with India, although it's hampered by corruption scandals and the apparent inability of Indian politicians like ours to resist the opportunity to grandstand on specific transactions. Asia's newfound integration is not limited to trade and investment. Islamic banking, with its now very appealing avoidance of leverage and derivatives, is as much a feature of finance in Malaysia as it is in the Persian Gulf. It's being taken up in China and elsewhere. Tourism, religious pilgrimages, student exchanges, and language learning are all in a sharp upswing. A few years ago, some were stunned to see China's President Hu Jintao shown around the world's largest oil company, Saudi Aramco, by a series of Chinese-speaking Saudi graduates of China's best engineering universities. In China, dozens of universities and institutes now teach Arabic. Hundreds of Chinese are enrolled in Arab universities. In a few trading centers in China, like the city of Yiwu in Zhejiang province, Arabic now rivals English as the second language of Chinese merchants. Central Television in China has a 24-hour Arabic language service. The appearance of Chinese officials who speak fluent Arabic on satellite news services like Al Jazeera has long since ceased to be a novelty. The success of Chinese oil companies in acquiring exploration and production rights in Iraq owes much to the proficiency in Arabic of Chinese officials and businessmen. Similarly, fluency in Russian, the lingua franca of Central Asia, has been key to China's ability to secure widening access to energy supplies there. Overall, meanwhile, the foreign student population in China has been growing by 20% per year. The largest number of such students come from other East Asian societies like South Korea, which is particularly well represented. But there are now also thousands of Indians studying in Chinese universities, for example. In an effort to boost competitiveness, India is adding the study of Chinese to its national primary school curriculum, with effect from the coming school year. This development reflects the astonishing advance of Sino-Indian ties, despite India's view of itself as China's strategic rival in Asia. Sino-Indian trade grew from $200 million in 1989 to $60 billion last year. China surpassed the United States as India's largest trading partner in 2007. The target for Sino-Indian trade in 2015 is $100 billion. Prospects for Sino-Indian economic cooperation are, in fact, particularly promising. the two countries' economies are broadly complementary in ways that invite cross-investment, with India disproportionately strong in services and China in industrial production. Investment had lagged until last year, but Premier Wen Jiabao's late year-end visit to South Asia was the occasion for new Chinese investment commitments to India and Pakistan of about $16 billion each. Both China and India depend on growing levels of raw material imports from Africa and Latin America and energy shipments from Africa and the Middle East. Despite their obvious common interests in securing sea lines of communication, there is, however, I think, real reason to doubt whether they will be able to cooperate militarily. The Sino-Indian frontier is about as long as the US border with Mexico, but a lot less peaceful. It is now the only land boundary that China has not managed to settle through peaceful negotiations. China and India fought a brief border war along that border in 1962, and there's still frequent encounters, sometimes violent, between their military patrols. Indian apprehensions about China's growing military power now play as large a role in driving its defense modernization as do its hostile relationship with Pakistan and the related conflict in Kashmir. India's concerns about China have pushed it to strengthen military ties with the United States. They've also led it to open security dialogue with similarly apprehensive countries to its east, like Vietnam and Japan. Since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan has been accustomed to be number one in Asia. But last year, China's economy displaced Japan's as the world's second largest. The rise of China has pushed Japan off balance psychologically and left it strategically perplexed, unsure about how to cope with its changing place in the Asian pecking order. Some in Tokyo see a defense relationship with India as a tactical, useful hedge against China, as the American political and economic leadership on which Japan long relied continues to ebb away. Last September's collision between a Chinese fishing boat with a drunken captain and Japanese Coast Guard vessels off the disputed Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands alarmed many in Japan. It pushed Tokyo closer, at least for a while, to Washington. It catalyzed the redeployment of Japan's self-defense forces away from Russia and toward the perceived threat of China. It also stimulated Japan to explore prospects for military cooperation with South Korea, something that deeply rooted antipathies on both sides had long made politically infeasible. Still, many factors, including most of all, Japan's rising dependence on growth in the Chinese economy for its future prosperity, continue to draw Japan closer to China. A full 20% of Japan's trade is now with China, which surpassed the United States as Japan's top economic partner some years ago. At over 25%, South Korea's dependence on the Chinese market is even larger. All of Eastern Asia, including Japanese and Korean companies, as well as those in China and Southeast Asia, is now inseparably connected through supply chain relationships. India is beginning to be drawn into these as well, and it's being drawn into other relationships with Eastern Asia. Its choice of Indonesia's president as its chief guest at this year's Republic Day celebrations in New Delhi is a big straw in this wind. The importance of Southeast Asia as a crucible for Asian economic integration is hard to overstate. Chinese communities there played a key role in the creation of what I call cadre capitalism in China, which incorporates many elements of overseas Chinese commercial and financial culture. The pan-Chinese consensus is that the business of China and its people is business. to paraphrase Calvin Coolidge's trenchant description of early 20th century America. This has facilitated the setting aside of territorial claims and other potential conflicts so that everyone can get on with making money, not war. As he hoped it would, Deng Xiaoping's notion that to get rich is glorious has birthed a greater China. It is healing the rift between Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait. Greater China includes the systemically distinctive political economies of the Chinese mainland, Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Its ideology, to the extent it has one, is best expressed in the orderly meritocracy and pragmatic use of industrial policy seen in Singapore. The economies of Greater China, the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, and to a lesser extent, traditionally much more protectionist Japan and South Korea, are now well along in forming a huge free trade area with which India and other South Asian countries are interested in associating themselves. Asia's remaining great power, the one I haven't mentioned, Russia, stands somewhat apart from these processes of integration, but not entirely. It remains a primary source of weapons systems and military technology for both India and China. It is becoming a significant energy supplier to China as well as Europe. The beaches of Hainan Island, Vietnam, and India are now the winter playground of the Russian middle class, where many bodies are turning bright pink as we speak. Lots of Russians are studying and working in China and elsewhere in Asia. Moscow joined with Beijing and Central Asian nations to form the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. The SCO seeks to deny the region, meaning Central Asia, mostly dominated by Kazakhstan on this map, seeks to deny that region to great power rivalries, Islamic extremism, and Chinese ethnic separatism. But Russia seems more focused on relationships with Europe than with Asia. Chinese linkages to Central Asia, its energy supplies, its transportation corridors, and so forth, are eroding Russia's traditional dominance there. Russia's sparsely populated but natural resource-rich Far Eastern region those regions are being drawn into the orbit of China, Korea, and Japan. Siberian agriculture is increasingly dependent on Chinese migrant labor. Russia's future relationship with the rest of Asia remains a bit of a wild card, as ill-defined and as undetermined as the Russian identity, Russian political system, or Russia's role in Europe and the Middle East. The implications of Asia's emergence as a much more integrated set of economies and societies are only beginning to become apparent, but they promise to be vast. We're already seeing this in the emergence of Asian supply chain economics as both the heart and the circulatory system of global trade. Most financial analysts expect that Asian currencies, like the Chinese yuan, will, in time, dilute the now dominant role of the dollar as the denominator of trade and international monetary reserves. The human and natural resource diversity of an ever more integrated Asia provides a firm basis for continued economic expansion amidst rapidly rising productivity. In 2050, again, only 40 years from now, our best bankers and economists say that China should have a GDP of over $70 trillion. By way of comparison, US GDP is now about $14 trillion. By 2050, it might be 35 trillion. I'm using constant dollars here. That same year, 2050, India's GDP should, we're told, be the same or even bigger than that of the United States. Other Asian economies like that of Indonesia should have grown proportionately. The figures may be disputable, But there's little reason to doubt that by mid-century, the world's economic center of gravity will be firmly lodged in Asia, somewhere between Beijing and Delhi. Arabs and Indonesians, Turks and Japanese, Indians and Americans, Europeans, Africans, Latin Americans, and others will be there alongside the Chinese. A rising China and India now lift all Asians. Asia has begun to lift the world. 3 centuries ago, Europe, followed by America, displaced Asia from its long-standing preeminence in scientific and technological innovation. Think of the invention of the zero, the compass, the rocket, paper money, movable type, chemistry, the beauty parlor, and the bank check, for example. These are respectively Indian, Chinese, Korean, Arab, and Islamic contributions to human civilization. But the ranks of the Asian educated are swelling, and institutions that can translate ideas into products, like research universities and venture capitalism, have already taken root on the continent. As this century proceeds, no one should be surprised to see Asia resume its seat at the head of the class. The prestige and influence of Asian culture can also be expected to grow. We seldom reflect on the extent to which Asian ways have already infiltrated our daily lives. A prior generation of Americans would have found our delight in sushi and sashimi absolutely unimaginable. Seaweed-wrapped rice and raw fish for dinner? You can't be serious. Indian-style body piercing, studs and hanging ornaments, once seen as barbarously exotic, now adorn, or depending on your viewpoint, disfigure many Americans, young and old. Please don't show me where you're pierced. The hookah has come to our cities in the form of shisha parlors. Sudoku is all the rage. People pay attention to feng shui, and our kids study the martial arts. What next from Asia? There will surely be something that now seems improbable. Before long, we will make it too ours, take it for granted, and forget its Asian origins. Before I close, I want to put forward a few observations on every American's favorite subject, the search for plausible enemies to replace the late Soviet Union. That Russian-dominated empire very irresponsibly dropped out of the race to dominate the world, leaving us to do it, but also giving us a bad case of enemy deprivation syndrome. We need an existential threat to rationalize spending more on our military than the rest of the world combined, and to justify exempting defense spending from the budget cuts necessitated by impending national bankruptcy. Russia just isn't up to the task anymore. So we've come up with 2 alternative candidates to do us in, one centered in Asia's west and one in its east, Islam and China. But neither really rises to the role we have assigned it. Muslims desire to resume a place of dignity in the world's affairs. That's what you're seeing in the streets today. They have been having an escalating and occasionally violent argument among themselves about how to order their societies. Some strongly oppose the influence of our culture on theirs and want to exclude it. Others, as the examples of Tunisia and Egypt show, embrace elements of the ideals in which modern Western political systems are grounded, without wishing to adopt either our model or our mores. All resent our backing of Israel against their co-religionists, and all but a few are horrified by our armed invasions of Muslim lands and their results. Most want us gone so they can sort out their differences among themselves. Few have any aspiration to convert us to their faith. None has the capacity to conquer us. Islam doesn't meet the existential threat test. It is a menace to our military domination of the countries that profess it, not a challenge to the independence, values, or security of a secular America. As for China, we seem most of all to fear that it might become like us, a country animated by armed evangelism, equipped with a military designed for power projection, and imbued with an impulse to impose its values on the world. In Chinese, the two ideograms that make up the word China, 中国, do mean central country. And in this century, China is very likely once again to live up to the sense of this name in many spheres of human endeavor. But China's in the middle of things in other respects as well. It is hemmed in by militarily powerful neighbors, Russia, India, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and of course the United States, which has a formidable naval presence right up against its 12-mile territorial limit, and a powerful land and sea presence to its west in Afghanistan and other places. China must manage many challenges to its national security, only a few of which directly concern the United States, and none of which are remote from its frontiers. In short, China faces too many immediate military, social, and economic development problems to be able to follow the United States in attempting to dominate the world, even if it were tempted to do so. The security environment in 21st century Asia will be characterized by shifting coalitions and balances with and against China. In this respect, Asia will resemble 19th century Europe. It too will offer an opportunity for offshore balancing should the United States wish to draw on the experience of Great Britain then. The British buttressed, sorry, that's kind of a tongue twister. So the British buttressed actors on the continent when and where they needed reinforcement to dissuade the ambitions of neighbors, but they seldom intervened directly. Not bad for government work. As a final illustration of the complexity of emerging Asian military realities, I want briefly to consider their nuclear dimension. Not counting the United States, which of course has nuclear capable forces on three sides of Asia, Asia is already home to 6 of the world's 9 nuclear-armed powers. In time, many suspect Iran could make this 7 out of 10. Even without Iran, the nuclear geometry in Asia is already pretty complex. China, Russia, and the United States aim at each other. North Korea targets Japan and South Korea and would target the United States if it could. India targets Pakistan and China. Pakistan targets India. So does China. Nobody with nuclear weapons yet targets Israel, but Israel aims its arsenal at everybody else. Neither India, nor Israel, nor Pakistan is a party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea has thumbed its nose at that treaty. This is one reason, all of this complexity is one reason that the continuing US focus on preventing nuclear proliferation now seems so quaint. The tigers are out of their cage. Asia is where theories of nuclear deterrence face their final exam. In this context, the grotesquely overbuilt nuclear arsenals that Russia and the United States inherited from our Cold War experiment with mutually assured destruction are irrelevant and a huge waste of money. The same could be said about some or all, maybe not all, some but not all, of the now well-established American hysteria about nuclear attacks by non-state actors. Every nation that has a bomb made a big investment to build it and has a compelling security problem its bomb is intended to address. No one's going to give away something that precious. Concerns about the deliberate transfer of weapons to terrorists seem greatly exaggerated, if not delusional. But there is a possibility that a breakdown of order within a state with a nuclear weapon might offer disgruntled elements or murderous extremists in it the chance to pilfer a bomb or two. In this context at present, Pakistani militants and Israeli settlers come to mind. Over the course of the decades to come, there are likely to be other situations like these to worry about, unless the sources of the conflicts that animate fanaticism can be addressed. Vigilance is therefore justified. So is a renewed focus on resolving civilizational conflicts, ending oppression, and building peace, justice, and prosperity in Asia as elsewhere. I want to sum up. The challenge to the United States is to harness Asia's progress to our own, not to dominate the continent or retard its advance. Asian prosperity is essential to American wealth and well-being. Asian intellectual excellence and economic productivity should spur us to raise our own performance standards, not seek to lower theirs. Asian innovations must be met by a renewed American commitment to science and technology, not closed minds, closed borders, and protectionism. Intra-Asian dynamics invite agile American diplomacy that can reduce our defense burden while containing conflict, not militaristic lurches into armed intervention there. We will not succeed if we fail to recognize that after a couple of bad millennia for the Greek idea of Asia, it's back. A large organism that fits the description is actually emerging. We cannot hope to handle this beast, let's call it an elephant, if we have a policy for its hindquarters, to put it politely, but not its trunk, head, legs, or belly. Each part of the Asian anatomy presents its own problems and calls for its own policy tools. But in some respects, the greatest challenge we face may be to see the continent as a whole and to conceive our strategy and act accordingly. Neither the current organization of our academies, nor our government, nor our recent experience fit us at all well for this recognition, but we must achieve it. Understanding the increased interconnectedness of Asia is a prerequisite, both for restored American leadership there and for effective global governance in the decades to come. Both are sorely needed. Thank you.
That was great. That only encouraged him. Hey, thanks, Chaz. That was really terrific. That metaphor at the end was fantastic. But the way you tied in Western Asia with the rest of Asia and brought into a context what's going on in the Arab world, Western Asia today with the rest of Asia was fascinating. So now we're going to open it up to questions. A few ground rules on questions. First of all, remember, no long questions. There are students, volunteers roaming around upstairs and downstairs. If you've got a question, raise your hand. They will give you a microphone. If your question goes on too long, the guy with the microphone will get a signal from me. He will grab the microphone back from you, okay? We're not taking written questions here tonight. We'll do that for the final panel on Sunday morning. We are taking, obviously, only written questions from the Hutch and from the Strand. You've got, those of you who are there, you have written, you have questions you can, a piece of paper in your document that you can fill out. Again, there are volunteers. Give the question to the volunteer, and that person will end up sending it here, and it'll appear on the screen. So with that as the ground rules, we'll start with number 2 in the back, and then we'll go there.
Thank you. Charles Cogan, Kennedy School. Though it's barely within the Asian mainland, I wonder if you could comment on today's vote in the United Nations, the veto of the United States on the settlements question.
I think it's politically disastrous for the United States. The timing is terrible, given what is happening in the broad Arab and Islamic parts of the world. We have had to deny the United Nations a role in a problem that it played a large role in, has played a large role in from the beginning. I mean, how do you think Israel got there? There was a UN resolution that declared partition. The United Nations was supposed to function as the global enforcer of its charter and international law. With our veto 47, I guess it's now 48 times, to protect Israel and the people in the region around it from the application of international law, we have turned the United Nations into the biggest obstacle to the rule of law that there is. So I see nothing good about it, although I'm sure it's politically expedient in many senses. It's not going to solve any problem. It's not going to advance anything toward a solution. It simply devalues our moral standing internationally.
Mackenzie Rockcliffe, the SPIA School at University of Maine, and you talked about educational connections between Asia and the Arab world, or China and the Arab world. And you also alluded to the need to change our academies. So if you could change U.S. education tomorrow, what would you do? And I don't know if you know this, but some Maine schools are actively recruiting Chinese students to fill our emptying schools.
Well, I'm not an educator, and nobody's going to make me put me in charge of changing U.S. education. So I think I will duck that question and leave it to the good educators in Maine to figure out. But I do think we live in a world in which we can no longer assume in the future that, as we have in the past, that everyone's going to speak English, that everybody's going to put up with measurements in feet and inches. In fact, we are the only country left that does this. And that some of the exceptionalism that we have practiced in terms of intellectual isolationism has got to go. One of the best things you can do for young Americans is both to give them a passport and encourage them to take a semester or year abroad, and to bring foreigners, bright students from other places, to join them on American campuses where they enrich the educational experience and remind everybody that we live in a world in which we can't escape connections as we once could.
Okay, we've got a question from one of the satellites. Should appear up here in a moment.
So the Wizard of Oz is back there.
Where is the wizard? Okay. What role does Indonesia play in your scheme?
Well, I don't really have a scheme. I'm going to let Tom Pickering answer that on Sunday morning. Indonesia is an enormously important country because of its size and its location. And I suspect that it is going to, as it did at the beginning at the end of the colonial era, India and Indonesia really together created the non-aligned movement. I would not be surprised to see India and Indonesia cooperating more closely in the future. And if, in fact, there are, as I posit, coalitions that involve China and act against it that are going to happen in Asia, then Indonesia is going to play a very key role in that constellation of power. So I think it's an excellent question, and and I'm sure Indonesia will play an increasing role, but I think it's too early to be terribly specific.
Do we have any questions from the audience here? Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Going back to the relationship between India and China, and a couple of years ago when we sort of told India it was okay for them to pursue their nuclear ambitions and we would kind of help out, how do you, if you were in charge, how do you think we should be playing off India and China to our advantage, or not playing them off at all?
Well, I don't think we need to think about playing them off against each other. They have enough concerns about each other to ensure that there's a natural dynamic there. I think it's one of the geniuses of British diplomacy in the 19th century with respect to the European continent was that they didn't pick permanent partners. They talked about having permanent interests and having no permanent allies. And I think if we wish to continue to function as the most important country in the world, even if others are increasingly important, and we cannot afford the levels of funding that we did in the past, we're going to have to remember the old adage that if you can't live by your wallet, you have to live by your wits. And we need to get a lot smarter. And part of that is not succumbing, not swooning over imagined affinities. Just a comment here on India in particular. Indians and Americans have an odd relationship. In some respects, we drive each other nuts because we're both so sure that we're right about everything and we don't agree about lots of things. But in other respects, we resemble each other. And the worst way we resemble each other is that both Indians and Americans expect anybody who does business with us to adore us. It's not enough that they do business with us. They have to admire us and not disagree with us on anything. That's not very realistic. And in the world to come, we're going to have to be a lot more sophisticated and a lot more forgiving about people doing things in un-American ways.
Good answer. Yeah. You've got something up there?
Yes. I have your presentation was very good and very instructive on the very important changes in the economy, the international economy as it affects all of Asia and ourselves. However, you made very little comment on the political atmosphere in the sense that I look at it, having been in the American Foreign Service back in the from 53 to 70, 83, and so on. But my specialty was Southeast Asia. Now, at that time, we promoted democracy as, let's say, the ideal form of governance. And indeed, there are already strong examples of that in India, which, of course, was started by the British. Would you make a comment, please, on the value of a democratic state as against, say, an autocratic state?
I think the best discussion of that is in Machiavelli, where he remarks that the merits of a republic, by which he means a democracy, are that it is terribly bad at making decisions and therefore has a lot of inertia to it. That makes it more predictable as an actor in international affairs, although I often think our example somewhat contradicts Machiavelli's insight. I don't think that the notion that democratic countries are destined to get along better with other democratic countries than others has any grounding whatsoever in history. The French are democratic, and we don't agree with them about lots of things. And I noticed that when a completely democratic, fair, free election was held in Palestine in 2006, we didn't like the results, and we've spent the last 5 years trying to undo them as best we can. We also seem to have a bit of ambivalence. We have no ambivalence about democracy in Iran. That would be good, because we don't like the Iranian regime, and if it were democratized out of existence, we'd be happy. But we are a little bit conflicted when it comes to places where the dictator or the autocrat in charge is our friend. But that's understandable. If you break faith with friends, you'll soon find you don't have very many. So it's not inconsequential. But we seem correctly to fear that the introduction of democracy would lead to decisions that were contrary to our interests or those of others whom we protect. So I'm quite neutral on this. I think democracy is a wonderful system for doing all sorts of things domestically. I agree with John Quincy Adams that America should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, nor should we be the vindicator and espouse our values anywhere but at home. I would like to see us live up to our own ideals before we start imposing them on others.
I'm Jim Warhola from the University of Maine, and about 3 weeks after the Russian-Georgian War in August of 2008, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev enunciated his 5 principles for Russian foreign policy, and the 5th of which was the whole idea of spheres of influence. And many, particularly in the United States, saw this as a sort of a dangerous anachronism or a throwback to 19th and perhaps early 20th century diplomacy. And I was just wondering if you would comment on your sense of the degree to which this disposition on the part of Russian foreign policy was either resisted throughout Asia or copied or just seen as just hopelessly anachronistic and ignored, or if it met sort of with an echo there, or if you could comment on that. Thank you very much.
Well, in the case of the war between Russia and Georgia, we know what other Asians thought of it because the Russian effort to obtain an endorsement of their position by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization failed. I don't think many countries like the idea of spheres of influence now. Certainly, the Chinese say they don't intend to create one, and their neighbors hope they're serious when they say that. The Russians have Russia has a serious problem, and Europe has a serious problem because even though 20 years have gone by since the end of the Cold War, Europe and Russia really have not developed any sense of where their boundary is. They have not developed. I'm not talking about a sphere of influence. I'm talking about where one should be aware of and pay some heed to the interests of another party. I'm not saying the other party should be allowed to dominate things. I've argued with Russian friends in Moscow and elsewhere on this very issue that the sphere of influence, in fact, is not a useful or viable concept in the 21st century, that the world has changed, that is impractical. It will not be tolerated either by the peoples on whom the sphere is imposed or sustained in a globalized political and economic system with all sorts of seepages across borders, everything from trade to the internet. I don't believe this is a valid concept. But having said that, I will say that in many respects, the United States' reaction to the Russian-Georgian War was as though Soviet collapse had made the entire world the American sphere of influence, such that nobody anywhere could do anything without our permission. That is a corollary to a very foolish idea that many Americans have. It rests on a misunderstanding of what happened in 1989 to 91. We did not win the Cold War. The Russians dropped out. They defaulted. So we should not spend a lot of time talking to ourselves about how wonderful we are and how brilliant we are. We should remember what George Kennan said in 1946, which was that if you allowed them to be walled off, their system would fall of its own infirmities. He turned out to be right. 40-some years after he said that, that is what happened. We came out of the Cold War as a result of the Soviet collapse. We inherited absolute military supremacy throughout the globe. We have no peer competitor, although we keep looking for one. We seem, without any discussion as a country, to have embraced the notion that our mission should be to perpetuate this global military supremacy, which is why we spend more than everybody else put together on our military. I think that is unaffordable. Our military is powerful but fiscally hollow. I think it is unsustainable. I think it is foolish. And I think the earlier we adjust our objectives to more reasonable and levels that are more respectful of other sovereignties, the better off we will be.
We've got one here, then we'll go to Rockland, and then we'll come back. Yeah.
I'd like you to comment, if you would, on how you think that the current or the recently increased political uncertainties in the Middle East, and in particular in the oil and natural gas exporting countries of that region, I wouldn't mention Saudi Arabia, of course, but in the oil and gas exporting countries of that region, may play out in East Asia. What kind of policy response one might envision from the security conscious, traditionally, countries of that region to their growing dependence, given that they are the source of most of the world's oil demand growth as projected into the future, as they look at this region where the most oil is going to be coming from, and how they view that and how that might play out?
I think those are really two very different questions. First, as to the reaction to the upheavals in the Middle East, I think this is a work in progress, but many Chinese intellectuals, for example, are deeply worried that this will result in a crackdown on civil society, such as it is in their country, a preemptive strike by the Communist Party, if you will, that precludes the kind of challenge to government authority that we've seen now in several countries in the Middle East. I think you see different reactions in the Chinese establishment to this concern. Premier Wen Jiabao is running around talking a lot about political reform, which is one response. Clearly others are talking about crackdown. So I don't think they've made up their mind. Dependence on oil and gas from the Middle East. It's a big political issue here, traditionally, even though we don't really depend that much on the Middle East for our oil and gas. It comes mainly from Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria. Saudi Arabia, I think, is now fifth. But all of this somehow misses the point. It doesn't matter where you get your oil and gas from. What matters is the global market. You have to think of this trade in oil and gas like a reservoir into which various streams are pouring. Where the streams come from and how they pour into the reservoir really doesn't matter. What matters is the level of the reservoir from which you and everybody else are drawing. And the international oil market, I mean, this is a bit of an oversimplification because a petroleum engineer will tell you that certain grades of oil require certain different mixes of catalysts and so forth. But generally speaking, it's fungible. So in other words, what we should be worried about is the global supply. The Middle East is a huge part of that. That is why we worry about the Middle East. But it isn't an American concern. You know, and one remarkable thing is that the United States Navy and occasionally other arms of our armed services provide for free to the entire world protection of those oil supplies and the lines of communication through which they are distributed. We are doing this not for ourselves, but with extraordinarily noble generosity we're doing it for everybody, including the Chinese, the Japanese, Europeans. You really have to wonder why there wouldn't be some thought given to burden sharing. But I know that's impossible to imagine, so we'll leave it there.
All right, from Rockland again. 10 years ago, I heard you describe China as not an imperial power, but mainly interested in its own territory, Taiwan and Tibet. Does recent Chinese policy towards islands in the East China and South China Sea change your view?
Not at all.
Okay.
No, it doesn't change my view on that. There's been no change in the Chinese claims on anything. There are maritime disputes which have been long-standing for what he thought were very good reasons. Deng Xiaoping declared, and everybody in China followed his advice, that these things should be shelved for at least 50 years. In other words, China should try to find ways, if there were oil and gas there, to work with others without regard to issues of sovereignty, to achieve, to exploit those resources. What's happened is that, it's a very complex series of very different issues, but China occupies some islands, some of them, interestingly, the Itu Aba, which is Taiping Dao, on which there is a Taiwanese garrison, a Chinese garrison from Taiwan. The U.S. Navy took that garrison there in 1945 to accept the Japanese surrender. So in 1945, we thought that was part of China. We were then the colonial power in the Philippines, which is the other claimant. Anyway, nobody remembers all this stuff. So, let's face it, the greatest strength of the United States is our capacity for amnesia. We have two different sets of island groups. The Senkaku Islands cannot be discussed by China with Japan for a very simple reason. If you think about it, all Chinese believe, rightly or wrongly, that the Senkakus are part of Taiwan, that they are part of Yilan County in Taiwan. And while China is trying to achieve reunification with Taiwan, it cannot go off and start talking about giving away bits of Taiwan's territory. Politically, that would be absurd. It would be suicidal and totally counterproductive. So the Chinese really don't want to talk about the Senkakus, and they thought they had a deal with the Japanese that everybody would just sort of go on the way they were. What they didn't count on was this drunk at the wheel of the fishing boat, or the fact that the Japanese have greatly beefed up their Coast Guard patrols. So if you want to find who's assertive in that region, it's probably not China, it's probably Japan. In the South China Sea, you've got a different situation. You have the major claimants are Vietnam and China. They're the two with the long-standing claims. The Philippines didn't have any claim until Ferdinand Marcos invented it, probably to divert attention from some other things he was doing. The Malaysians invented their claim, I think, in 1967. Brunei claims a reef, but not very intensely. They're very nice people. So the claimants are really Vietnam and China, and I've talked to people in Beijing and Hanoi about this, and the Vietnamese say, well, the French, when they were here, they exercised jurisdiction, control over those islands. They had them administratively, and we can prove that. So I said, well, why don't you? And they said, well, the documents are all in French, and they're in Paris, and they won't give them to us. Which is entirely possible. And the Chinese have claims that if you go back and you read the record of U.S.-China relations in the 1920s, you will find Chiang Kai-shek's government repeatedly protesting activities, asserting these claims in the islands. The famous dotted line, the tongue of the dragon that comes down into the South China Sea. I probably shouldn't identify the person who said this, but I had a talk with a very senior Chinese military officer not long ago, and I asked him what this meant. And his first reaction was, well, why don't you ask the ghost of Chiang Kai-shek, because he's the guy who drew it. It had nothing to do with us. We inherited it. Second point, however, is that it's a dotted line because it means that all the land features within it belong to China. It does not mean the sea belongs to China. It does not mean the law of the sea does not apply there. And there is, in fact, no freedom of navigation issue in that area. So there are problems with very aggressive U.S. naval patrols right outside Chinese harbors. And you could imagine how we might react if there were lots of Chinese patrols 12 miles outside San Diego, and if whenever we had a military exercise, there were sonar arrays towed through it by Chinese vessels and so on. So, the real issue is not freedom of navigation. It's an argument over interaction right off the coast. And it's got legal dimensions and it's got political dimensions. But no, I don't see the Chinese as having changed their position at all. And I don't think there's any evidence they have. Same thing's true on the Sino-Indian border, by the way. Their position from the beginning has been that it should be settled on the basis of uti possidetis is the Latin phrase, whatever you have, possession determines the law. So they don't propose to change the actual line of control. There isn't any change there.
We got time for one more question right here, and then we'll have you out by 9:30.
Good.
As promised.
My name is Bob Tutnauer. Would you feel that the United States has any responsibility for the survival of Israel, or at least to help them survive? And if so, how should we go about doing it? And if not, why not?
Yes, I think we've invested so much in that issue that we can't escape responsibility. But the good news is that the only threat to the survival of Israel is from Israelis. That is to say, Israel faces no conventional military threat at all, and it's straining to find a nuclear threat from Iran. And it has the Palestinian territories under total lock and key, and it has Gaza surrounded and under siege, and is not treating its inhabitants terribly well. So Israel doesn't face any threat of a classic military nature, certainly not at present, and certainly as long as the Camp David framework lasts. What it does face is a series of serious identity issues and problems domestically. It has a population, a fair part of which does not accept the validity of the state or its existence, is not willing to join its armed forces or fight for it, and does not want to work. Prefers to pray all day, which is nice if you can do it. It has a settler movement that is viciously racist and that has totally discredited Israel's moral image, which was strong in the 50s and 60s internationally. 20% of Israelis now live outside, Israeli Jews now live outside Israel, because these things cause stress, they cause conflict, they cause moral concerns, and so yes, I think we ought to step up and be responsible for helping Israel to survive, and that means stopping the enablement of bad behavior. If you enable an alcoholic to take a drink, it does not express love. It expresses something quite different. And our relationship with Israel, in many respects, is that of enabler. But should we do everything possible to help Israel survive, both from foreign enemies and domestic? Yes.
It's an incredible opening keynote speech. You covered everything from Israel to Egypt
Well,
to
that's 'cause you
China
asked me
to
to do it.
Japan. No, but many thanks, yes.
Sure.
It was
Okay.
great. It was
Thank
great.
you.